Ira, the relationship between a mother and a daughter, or a mother and a son, isn't all that complicated. I have a daughter, I told him. I know about daughters. It's one thing to be with your daughter because you're infatuated with her, because you're in love. It's another to be with her because you're terrified of her. Ira, the daughter's rage at her mother's remarrying will doom your household from the start. Every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. I am simply describing to you the way that family is unhappy. That's when he lit into me. Look, I don't live on Lehigh Avenue, he told me. I love your Doris. She's a wonderful wife and a wonderful mother, but I am not myself interested in the bourgeois Jewish marriage and the two sets of dishes. I have never lived inside the bourgeois conventions, and I have no intention of starting now. You actually propose that I give up a woman I love? A talented, wonderful human being whose life, by the way, hasn't been a bed of roses either? Give her up and run away because of this kid who plays the harp? That, to you, is the great problem in my life? The problem in my life is that union I belong to, Murray. Moving that goddamn actors union from where it's stuck to where it belongs. The problem in my life is the writer for my show. My problem isn't being a hindrance to Eve's kid. I'm a hindrance to Artie Sokolow. That's the problem. I sit down with this guy before he turns in the script, and I go over it with him, and if I don't like my lines, Murray, I tell him so. I won't do the goddamn lines if I don't like them. I sit down and I fight with him till he gives me something to say that gets across a message that's socially useful. Leave it to Ira to aggressively miss the point. His mind moved, all right, but not with clarity. It moved only with force. I don't care, I told him, if you're strutting the stage and telling people how to write their scripts. I'm talking about something else. I'm not talking about conventional or unconventional or bourgeois or bohemian. I'm talking about a household where the mother is a pathetic carpet for the daughter to stomp on. It's crazy that you, the son of our father who grew up in our house, won't recognize how explosive domestic arrangements can be, how ruinous to people. The enervating bickering, the daily desperation, the hour-by-hour negotiation. This is a household that is completely out of whack. Well, it wasn't hard for Ira to say, fuck off, and never see you again. He didn't modulate. There's first gear, and then suddenly there's fifth gear, and he's gone. I couldn't stop. I wouldn't stop. And so he tells me to go fuck myself, and he leaves. 6 weeks later, I wrote him a letter he didn't answer. Then I made phone calls he wouldn't answer. In the end, I went to New York, and I corralled the guy, and I apologized. You were right. I was wrong. It's none of my business. We miss you. We want you to come over. You want to bring Eve, bring her. You don't want to, don't. Lorraine misses you. She loves you, and she doesn't know what happened. Doris misses you, etc. I wanted to say, you've got your eye on the wrong menace. The menace to you is not imperialist capitalism. The menace to you isn't your public actions. The menace to you is your private life. It always was, and it always will be. There were nights I couldn't sleep. I'd say to Doris, why doesn't he leave? Why can't he leave? And do you know what Doris would answer? Because he's like everybody. You only realize things when they're over. Why don't you leave me? All the human stuff that makes it hard for anybody to be with anybody else. Don't we have it? We have arguments, we have disagreements, we have what everybody has. The little this and the little that, the little insults that pile up, the little temptations that pile up. Don't you think I know that there are women who are attracted to you? Teachers at school, women in the union, powerfully attracted to my husband. Don't you think I know you had a year after you got back from the war when you didn't know why you were still with me? When you asked yourself every day, why don't I leave her? But you didn't. Because by and large, people don't. Everyone's dissatisfied, but by and large, not leaving is what people do. Especially people who've been left themselves, like you and your brother. Come through what you two came through, and you value stability very highly. Probably overvalue it. The hardest thing in the world is to cut the knot of your life and leave. People make 10,000 adjustments to even the most pathological behavior. Why emotionally is a man of his type reciprocally connected to a woman of her type? The usual reason. Their flaws fit. Ira cannot leave that marriage any more than he can leave the Communist Party. Anyway, the baby, Johnny O'Day Ringgold. Eve told Ira that when she had Silford out in Hollywood, it was different for her than it was for Pennington. When Pennington went off every day to work in a movie, everybody accepted it. When she went off every day to work in a movie, the baby was left with the governess, and so Eve was a bad mother, a neglectful mother, a selfish mother, and everybody was unhappy, including her. She told him she couldn't go through that again. It had been too hard on her, too hard on Silford. She told Ira that in many ways that strain was what had ruined her Hollywood career. But Ira said she wasn't in movies anymore, she was in radio. She was at the top of radio. She didn't go off every day to a studio. She went off 2 days a week. It wasn't the same at all, and Ira Ringgold wasn't Carlton Pennington. He wouldn't leave her in the lurch with the kid. They wouldn't need any governess. To hell with that. He'd raise their Johnny O'Day himself if he had to. Once Ira got something between his teeth, he wasn't about to let go, and Eve wasn't somebody who could take the barrage. People went after her, and she collapsed. And so he believed he convinced her on this score, too. Finally, she said to him he was right. It wasn't at all the same. And she said, okay, they'd have the baby. And he was euphoric. In seventh heaven, you should have heard him. But then, that night, before he came over to Newark, the night before you two met, she broke down and she said she couldn't go through with it. She told him how wretched she felt denying him something he wanted so much, but she couldn't live through it all again. This went on for hours, and what could he do? What good was it going to do anybody? Her or him or little Johnny, for this to be the backdrop to their family life. He was miserable. And they were up till 3 or 4 that night, but it was over as far as he was concerned. He was a persistent guy, but he couldn't tie her to a bed and keep her there for 7 more months in order to have a child. If she didn't want it, she didn't want it. And so he told her he'd go with her down to Camden to the abortion doctor. She wouldn't be alone. Listening to Murray, I couldn't help but be overtaken by memories of being with Ira. Memories I didn't even know I continued to have. Memories of how I used to gorge myself on his words and on his adult convictions. Solid memories of the two of us walking in Weequahic Park and his telling me about the impoverished kids he'd seen in Iran. Pronounced by Ira, Iran. When I got to Iran, Ira told me, the natives there suffered from every type of illness you can think of. Being Muslim, they used to wash their hands before and after defecating, but they did it in the river that was in front of us, so to speak. They washed their hands in the same water they urinated in. Their living conditions were terrible, Nathan. The place was run by sheiks, and not romantic sheiks. These guys were like the dictator of the tribe, you understand? The army gave them money so the natives would work for us, and we gave the natives rations of rice and tea. That was it. Rice and tea. Those living conditions, I had never seen anything like it. I grubbed for work in the Depression. I hadn't been brought up at the Ritz, but this was something else. When we had to defecate, for instance, we defecated into GI pails, iron buckets. That's what they were. And somebody had to empty them out, and so we emptied them out in the garbage dump. And who do you think was there? All at once, Ira couldn't go on, couldn't speak. He couldn't walk. It would always alarm me when this happened to him, and because he knew that, he tapped the air with his hand, signaling me to be still, to wait him out. He'd be all right. Things that were not to his liking he could not discuss with equilibrium. His whole manly bearing could be altered almost beyond recognition by anything that involved human degradation, and perhaps because of his own shattered development as a boy, that involved particularly the suffering and degradation of children. When he said to me, "And who do you think was there?" I knew who was there because of the way he began to breathe. Gasping like someone about to die. When he was emotionally intact enough to resume the walk, I asked as though I didn't know, "Who, Ira? Who was there?" "The kids. They live there, and they would pick through the garbage dump for food." This time, when he stopped speaking, my alarm got the better of me, fearful that he might get stuck, be so overwhelmed, not only by his emotions, but by an immense loneliness that seemed suddenly to strip him of his strength, that he'd never find the way back to being the brave, angry hero I adored. I knew I had to do something, anything I could, so I tried at least to complete his thought for him. I said, "And it was awful." He patted my back, and we started walking again. "To me it was," he finally replied. "To my army buddies it mattered not. I never heard anybody comment on it. I never saw anybody from my own America deploring the situation. I was really pissed, but there was nothing I could do about it. In the Army, there's no democracy, you understand? You don't go telling anybody higher up. And this had been going on for God knows how long. This is what world history is. That's how people live. Then he erupted. This is how people make them live. We took trips around Newark together so that Ira could show me the non-Jewish neighborhoods I didn't really know. The First Ward, where he'd been brought up and where the poor Italians lived. Down Neck, where the poor Irish and poor Poles lived. And Ira all the while explaining to me that, contrary to what I might have heard growing up, these were not simply Goyim, but working people like working people all over the country, diligent, poor, powerless, struggling every goddamn day to live a decent and dignified life. We went into Newark's Third Ward, where the Negroes had come to occupy the streets and houses of the old Jewish immigrant slum. Ira spoke to everyone he saw, men and women, boys and girls, asked what they did and how they lived, and what they thought about maybe changing the crappy system and the whole damn pattern of ignorant cruelty that deprived them of their equality. He'd sit down on a bench outside a Negro barber shop on shabby Spruce Street around the corner from where my father had been raised in a Belmont Avenue tenement, say to the men congregated on the sidewalk, "I'm ever a guy to butt into other people's conversations," and begin talking to them about their equality. And to me, he never looked more like the elongated Abraham Lincoln who was cast in bronze at the foot of the broad stairway leading up to Newark's Essex County Courthouse. Gutson Borglum's locally famous Lincoln, seated and waiting welcomingly on a marble bench before the courthouse, in his sociable posture and by his gaunt, bearded face, revealing that he is wise and grave and fatherly and judicious and good. Out in front of that Spruce Street barbershop, with Ira declaiming, when someone asked his opinion, that a Negro has the right to eat any damn place he feels like paying the check, I realized that I'd never before imagined, let alone seen, a white person being so easygoing and at home with Negroes. What most people mistake for Negro sullenness and stupidity, you know what that is, Nathan? It's a protective shell. But when they meet somebody who is free of race prejudice, you see what happens? They don't need that shell. They got their share of psycho, sure, but you tell me who doesn't. When Ira one day discovered outside the barber shop a very old, bitter black man who liked nothing better than to vent his spleen in vehement discussion about the beastliness of humanity. Everything we know of has developed not out of the tyranny of tyrants, but out of the tyranny of mankind's greed, ignorance, brutality, and hatred. The tyrant of evil is every man. We went back several times more, and people gathered round to hear Ira going at it with this impressive malcontent who was always neatly dressed in a dark suit and a tie, and who all the other men respectfully called Mr. Prescott. Ira proselytizing one-on-one, one Negro at a time, the Lincoln-Douglas debates in a strange new form. "Are you still convinced," Ira asked him graciously, "that the working class will go along for the crumbs from the imperialists' table?" "I am, sir. The mass of men of whatever color is and always will be mindless, torpid, wicked, and stupid. If ever they should become less impoverished, they will be even more mindless, torpid, wicked, and stupid." "Well, I've been thinking about that, Mr. Prescott, and I'm convinced that you are in error. The simple fact that there aren't enough crumbs to keep the working class fed and docile refutes that theory. All you gentlemen here are underestimating the proximity of industrial collapse. It's true that most of our working people would stick with Truman and the Marshall Plan if they were sure it would keep them employed. But the contradiction is this. The channeling of the bulk of production to war materiel, both for the American forces and for those of the puppet governments, is impoverishing the American workers. Even in the face of Mr. Prescott's seemingly hard-won misanthropy, Ira tried to insert some reason and hope into the discussion, plant, if not in Mr. Prescott, then in the sidewalk audience, an awareness of the transformations that could be effected in men's lives through concerted political action. For me it was, as Wordsworth described the days of the French Revolution, very heaven. Bliss was it in that dawn to be alive, but to be young was very heaven. The two of us, white and surrounded by some 10 or 12 black men, and there was nothing for us to worry about and nothing for any of them to fear. It was not we who were their oppressors, or they who were our enemies. The oppressor enemy, by which we were all appalled, was the way society was organized and run. It was after the first visit to Spruce Street that he treated me to cheesecake at the Weequake Diner, and while we ate, told me about the Negroes he worked with in Chicago. This plant was in the heart of Chicago's Black Belt, he said. About 95% of the employees were colored, and there is where the spree I was telling you about enters in. It's the only place I've ever been where a Negro is on an absolutely equal footing with everybody else. So the whites don't feel guilty and the Negroes don't feel mad all the time, you understand? Promotions based solely on seniority, no finagling about it. What are Negroes like when you work with them? As far as I can determine, there was no suspicion of us whites. First off, the colored people knew that any white the UE sent to this plant was either a communist or a pretty faithful fellow traveler, so they weren't inhibited. They knew that we were as free from race prejudice as an adult in this time in society can be. When you saw a paper being read, about 2 to 1 it was the Daily Worker. The Chicago Defender and the Racing Form were about neck and neck for second place. Hearst and McCormick strictly ruled off the track. But what are Negroes actually like, personally? Well, buddy, there are some ugly types, if that's what you're asking me. That has a basis in actuality, but that's a small minority. And an L-ride through the Negro ghettos is enough to indicate to anyone with an open mind what warps people into these shapes. The characteristic I was most aware of among the Negro people is their warm friendliness. And at our record factory, the love of music. At our factory, there were speakers all over the place, amplifiers, and anybody who wanted a special tune played. And this is all on working time, just had to request it. The guys would sing jive, not uncommon for a guy to grab a girl and dance. About a third of the employees were Negro girls, nice girls. We'd smoke, read, brew coffee, argue at the top of our voices, and the work went right along without a hitch or a break. Did you have Negro friends? Sure, I did. There was a big guy named Earl something or other, who I took a liking to right away because he looked like Paul Robeson. It didn't take me long to discover that he was about the same kind of tramp working stiff as me. Earl would ride the streetcar an hour as far as I did, and we made a point to take the same ones, the way guys do, to have somebody to chew the fat with. Right up to the plant gates, Earl and me would talk and laugh the same as we did on the job. But once inside, where there were whites he doesn't know, Earl clams right up and just says, "So long," when I get off the L. That's it, you understand? In the pages of the small brown notebooks that Ira had brought back from the war, interspersed among his observations and the statements of belief, were the names and stateside addresses of about every politically like-minded soldier he had met in the service. He had begun to track these men down, sending letters all over the country and visiting the guys who lived in New York and Jersey. One day, we took a ride up to suburban Maplewood, just west of Newark, to visit former Sergeant Irwin Goldstein, who in Iran had been as far to the left as Johnny O'Day. A very well-developed Marxist, Ira called him, but who back home, we discovered, had married into a family that owned a Newark mattress factory, and now, a father of 3, had become an adherent of everything he had once opposed. About Taft-Hartley, about race relations, about price controls. He didn't even argue with Ira. He just laughed. Goldstein's wife and his kids were away with the in-laws for the afternoon, and we sat together in his kitchen drinking soda while Goldstein, a wiry little guy with the haughty, knowing air of a street corner sharpie, laughed and sneered at everything Ira said. His explanation for his turnabout? Didn't know shit from Shinola. Didn't know what I was talking about. To me, Goldstein said, "Kid, don't listen to him. You live in America, it's the greatest country in the world, and it's the greatest system in the world. Sure, people get shit on. You think they don't get shit on in the Soviet Union?" He tells you capitalism is a dog-eat-dog system. What is life if not a dog-eat-dog system? This is a system that is in tune with life, and because it is, it works. Look, everything the communists say about capitalism is true, and everything the capitalists say about communism is true. The difference is our system works because it's based on the truth about people's selfishness, and theirs doesn't because it's based on a fairy tale about people's brotherhood. Such a crazy fairy tale, they got to take people and put them in Siberia in order to get them to believe it. In order to get them to believe in their brotherhood, they've got to control people's every thought or shoot them. And meanwhile, in America, in Europe, the communists go on with this fairy tale even when they know what is really there. Sure, for a while, you don't know. But what don't you know? You know human beings, so you know everything. You know that the fairy tale cannot be possible. If you're a very young man, I suppose it's okay, 20, 21, 22, okay. But after that, no reason that a person with an average intelligence can take this story, this fairy tale of communism, and swallow it. We will do something that will be wonderful. But we know what our brother is, don't we? He's a shit. And we know what our friend is, don't we? He's a semi-shit. And we are semi-shits. So how can it be wonderful? Not even cynicism, not even skepticism, just ordinary powers of human observation tell us that is not possible. You want to come down to my capitalist factory and watch a mattress being made the way a capitalist makes a mattress? You come down and you'll talk to real working guys. This guy's a radio star. You're not talking to a working man, you're talking to a radio star. Come on, Ira. You're a star like Jack Benny. What the hell do you know about work? The kid comes to my factory, he'll see how we manufacture a mattress. He'll see the care we take. He'll see how I have to stand over the whole operation every step of the way to see that they don't fuck up my mattress. He'll see what it is to be the evil owner of the means of production. It's to work your ass off 24 hours a day. The workers go home at 5 o'clock. I don't. I'm there till midnight every night. I come home and I don't sleep because I'm doing the books in my head, and then I'm there again at 6 in the morning to open the place up. Don't let them fill you full of communist ideas, kid. They're all lies. Make money. Money's not a lie. Money is the democratic way to keep score. Make your money, then, if you still have to, then you make your points about the brotherhood of man. Ira leaned back in his chair, raised his arms so that his huge hands were interlaced behind his neck, and his contempt undisguised said, though not to our host, but so as to gall him to the utmost pointedly to me, "You know one of life's best feelings, maybe the best? Not being afraid. The mercenary schmuck whose house we are in, you know what his story is? He is afraid. That's the simple fact of it. In World War II, Irwin Goldstein was not afraid, but now the war is over. And Irwin Goldstein is afraid of his wife, afraid of his father-in-law, afraid of the bill collector. He's afraid of everything. You look with your big eyes into the capitalist shop window. You want and you want. You grab and you grab. You take and you take. You acquire and you own and you accumulate, and there is the end of your convictions and the beginning of your fear. There is nothing that I have that I can't give up. You understand? Nothing has come my way that I'm tied and bound to like a mercenary is. How I ever got from my father's miserable house on Factory Street to being this character Iron Rin, how Ira Ringgold, with 1.5 years of high school behind him, got to meeting the people I meet and knowing the people I know and having the comforts I have now as a card-carrying member of the privileged class. That is all so unbelievable that losing everything overnight would not seem so strange to me. You understand? You understand me? I can go back to the Midwest, I can work in the mills, and if I have to, I will. Anything but to become a rabbit like this guy. That's what you now are politically, he said, looking at last at Goldstein. Not a man, a rabbit. A rabbit of no consequence. Full of shit in Iran, and full of shit still, Iron Man. Then again, to me, I was the sounding board, the straight man, the fuse on the bomb, Goldstein said. Nobody could ever listen to anything he says. Nobody could ever take him seriously. The guy's a joke. He can't think, never could. Doesn't know anything, doesn't see anything, doesn't learn anything. The communists get a dummy like Ira and they use him. Mankind at its stupidest doesn't come any stupider. Then, turning to Ira, he said, "Get out of my house, you dumb communist prick." My heart was already wildly thumping before I even saw the pistol that Goldstein had drawn out of a kitchen cabinet drawer, out of the drawer right behind him where the silverware was stored. Up close, I'd never seen a pistol before, except tucked safely away in the hip holster of a newer cop. It wasn't because Goldstein was small that the pistol looked big. It was big, improbably big, black and well-made, molded, machined, eloquent with possibility. Though Goldstein was standing and pointing the pistol at Ira's forehead, even up on his feet he wasn't much taller than Ira was seated. "I'm scared of you, Ira," Goldstein said to him. "I've always been scared of you. You're a wild man, Ira. I'm not going to wait for you to do to me what you did to Butts. Remember Butts? Remember little Butts? Get up and get out, Iron Man. Take Kid Aslick with you. Aslick? Didn't the Iron Man ever tell you about Butts?" Goldstein said to me. "He tried to kill Butts. He tried to drown Butts. He dragged Butts out of the mess hall. Didn't you tell the kid, Ira, about you in Iran? About the rages and the tantrums in Iran? Guy weighing 120 pounds comes at the Iron Man here with a mess kit knife. Very dangerous weapon, you see. And the Iron Man picks him up, carries him out of the mess hall, drags him down to the docks, and holds him upside down over the water, holds him by his feet, and he says, Swim, hillbilly. Butts is crying, no, I can't. And the Iron Man says, can't you? And drops him in, head first, over the side of the dock into the Shat al-Arab. River's 30 feet deep. Butts goes straight down. Then Ira turns, and he's screaming at us. Leave the redneck bastard alone. Get out of here. Nobody go near the water. He's drowning, Iron Man. Let him, says Ira. Stay back. I know what I'm doing. Let him go down. Somebody jumps in the water to try and get at Butts, and so Ira jumps in after him, lands on him, starts pummeling the guy's head and gouging his eyes and holding him under. You didn't tell the kid about Butts? How come? Didn't you tell him about Garwich either? About Solak? About Becker? Get up. Get up and get out, you crazy fucking homicidal nut. But Ira didn't move, except for his eyes. His eyes were like birds that wanted to fly out of his face. They were twitching and blinking in a way I'd never seen before, while along the entire length of him he looked as though he'd ossified, assumed a tautness as terrifying as the flapping of his eyes. No, Irwin, he said, not with a sidearm in my face. Only ways to get me out are pull the trigger or call the cops. I couldn't have said which of them was more frightening. Why didn't Ira do what Goldstein wanted? Why didn't the two of us get up and go? Who was crazier, the mattress manufacturer with the loaded pistol, or the giant daring him to fire it? What was happening here? We were in a sunny kitchen in Maplewood, New Jersey, drinking Royal Crown from the bottle. We were all three of us Jews. Ira had come by to say hello to an old army buddy. What was wrong with these guys? It was when I began to tremble that Ira ceased to look deformed by whatever anti-rational thought he was thinking. Across the table from him, he saw my teeth chattering all on their own, my hands uncontrollably shaking all on their own, and he came to his senses and slowly rose from the chair. He raised his arms over his head the way they do when the bank robbers in the movie shout, "It's a stick-up." All over, Nathan. Quarrel called on account of darkness. But despite the easygoing way he managed to say that, despite the surrender that was implicit in his mockingly raised arms, as we left the house through the kitchen door and made our way down the driveway to Murray's car, Goldstein continued after us, his pistol only inches from Ira's skull. In a sort of trance-like state, Ira drove us through the quiet Maplewood streets, past all the pleasant one-family houses where there lived the ex-Newark Jews who'd lately acquired their first homes and their first lawns and their first country club affiliations. Not the sort of people or the sort of neighborhood where you'd expect to find a pistol in with the dinnerware. Only when we crossed the Irvington line and were heading into Newark did Ira come around and ask, "You okay?" I was miserable, though less frightened now than humiliated and ashamed. Clearing my throat so as to be sure to speak in an unbroken voice, I said, "I pissed in my pants." "Did you? I thought he was going to kill you." "You were brave. You were very brave. You were fine." "Walking down that driveway, I pissed in my pants," I said angrily. "God damn it, shit." "It's my fault, the whole thing, exposing you to that putz. Pulling a gun. A gun. Why did he do that?" "Butts didn't drown," Ira suddenly said. "Nobody drowned. Nobody was going to drown." "Did you throw him in?" Sure, I threw him in. This was the hillbilly who called me a kike. I told you that story." "I remember." But what he told me was only a part of that story. "That's the night they waylaid you. They beat you up." "Yeah, they beat me all right. After they fished the son of a bitch out." He let me off at my house, where no one was at home, and I was able to drop my damn clothing into the hamper and take a shower and calm down. I had the shakes again in the shower, not so much because I was remembering sitting at the kitchen table with Goldstein pointing his pistol at Ira's forehead, or remembering Ira's eyes looking like they wanted to fly out of his head, but because I was thinking, a loaded pistol in with the forks and knives? In Maplewood, New Jersey? Why? Because of Garwich, that's why. Because of Solak. Because of Becker. All the questions I hadn't dared to ask him in the car, I started asking aloud, alone, in the shower. What did you do to them, Ira? My father, unlike my mother, didn't see Ira as a means of social advancement for me and was always perplexed and bothered by his calling me. What is this grown man's interest in this kid? He thought something complicated, if not downright sinister, was going on. "Where do you go with him?" my father asked me. His suspiciousness erupted vehemently one night when he found me at my desk reading a copy of the Daily Worker. I don't want the Hearst papers in my house, my father told me, and I don't want that paper in my house. One is the mirror image of the other. If this man is giving you the Daily Worker, what man? Your actor friend, Rin, as he calls himself. He doesn't give me the Daily Worker. I bought it downtown. I bought it myself. Is there a law against that? Who told you to buy it? Did he tell you to go out and buy it? He doesn't tell me to do anything. I hope that's true. I don't lie. It is. It was. I remembered Ira saying that there was a column in the Worker by Howard Fast, but it was on my own that I had bought the paper across from Proctor's movie theater at a Market Street newsstand, ostensibly to read Howard Fast, but also out of a simple, dogged curiosity. Are you going to confiscate it? I asked my father. No, you're out of luck. I am not going to make you a martyr to the First Amendment. I only hope that after you've read it and studied and thought about it, you have the good sense to know that it's a sheet of lies and to confiscate it yourself. Toward the end of the school year, when Ira invited me to spend a week up at the shack with him that summer, my father said I wasn't going unless Ira had a talk with him first. Why? I demanded to know. I want to ask him some questions. What are you, the House Un-American Activities Committee? Why are you making such a big thing out of this? Because in my eyes, you are a big thing. What's his telephone number in New York? You can't ask him questions about what? You have your right as an American to buy and read the Daily Worker. I have a right as an American to ask anybody anything I want. If he doesn't want to answer me, that's his right. And if he doesn't want to answer, what's he supposed to do? Take the Fifth Amendment? No. He can tell me to go jump in the lake. I just explained it to you. That's how we do it in the USA. I don't say that's going to work for you in the Soviet Union with the secret police, but here, that's all it ordinarily takes for a fellow citizen to leave you alone about your political ideas. Do they leave you alone, I asked bitterly. Does Congressman Dies leave you alone? Does Congressman Rankin leave you alone? Maybe you better explain to them. I had to sit there, he told me I had to, and listen to him while he asked Ira on the phone to come over to his office for a talk. Iron Rin and Eve Frame were the biggest things ever to enter the Zuckerman household from the outside world, yet it was clear from my father's tone that this didn't throw him at all. He said, yes? I asked when my father hung up. He said he'd be there if Nathan would be there. You're going to be there. Oh, no, I'm not. Yep, my father said. You are. You are if you want me even to begin to consider your going up there to visit. What are you afraid of, an open discussion of ideas? It's going to be democracy in action next Wednesday after school at 3:30 in my office. You be on time, son. What was I afraid of? My father's anger? Ira's temper? What if, because of how my father attacked him, Ira picked him up bodily the way he picked up butts, carried him down to the lake at Weequahic Park, and threw him in? If a fight broke out, if Ira threw a lethal punch. My father's chiropody office was on the ground floor of a three-family house at the bottom of Hawthorne Avenue, a modest dwelling in need of a facelift near the rundown edge of an otherwise plainly pedestrian neighborhood. I was there early, feeling sick to my stomach. Ira, looking serious and not at all enraged as yet, arrived promptly at 3:30. My father asked him to be seated. Mr. Ringgold, my son Nathan is not a run-of-the-mill boy. He's an older son who is an excellent student and who I believe is advanced and mature beyond his years. We are very proud of him. I want to give him all the latitude I can. I try not to stand in his way in life as some fathers do, but because I honestly happen to think that for him the sky is the limit, I don't want anything to happen to him. If anything should happen to this boy, my father's voice grew husky, and he abruptly stopped talking. I was terrified that Ira was going to laugh at him, to mock him the way he mocked Goldstein. I knew that my father was choked up, not merely because of me and my promise, but because his two youngest brothers, the first members of that large, poor family of his who were targeted to go to a real college and become real doctors, had both died of illnesses in their late teens. Studio portrait photos of them rested next to each other in twin frames on our dining room sideboard. I should have explained to Ira about Sam and Sidney, I thought. I have to ask you a question, Mr. Ringgold, that I don't want to ask you. I don't consider another person's beliefs, religious, political, or otherwise, my business. I respect your privacy. I can assure you that whatever you say here will not go beyond this room, but I want to know whether you are a communist, and I want my son to know whether you are a communist. I'm not asking if you have ever been a communist. I don't care about the past. I care about right now. I have to tell you that back before Roosevelt, I was so disgusted with the way things were going in this country and with the anti-Semitism and the anti-Negro prejudice in this country and with how the Republicans scorned the unfortunate in this country and with how the greed of big business was milking the people of this country to get that one day right here in Newark, and this will come as a shock to my son, who thinks his father, a lifelong Democrat, is to the right of Franco. But one day, well, Nathan, he said, looking now at me, they had their headquarters. You know where the Robert Treat Hotel is? Right down the street? Upstairs, 38 Park Lane. They had offices up there. One was the office of the Communist Party. I never even told this to your mother. She would have killed me. She was my girlfriend then. This must be 1930. Well, one day, I was angry. Something had happened. I don't even remember what it was any longer. But I read something in the papers, and I remember that I went up there, and nobody was there. The door was locked. They'd gone to lunch. I rattled the door handle. That's as close as I got to the Communist Party. I rattled the door and said, "Let me in." You didn't know that, did you, son? No, I said. Well, now you do. Luckily, the door was locked. And in the next election, Franklin Roosevelt became the president, and a kind of capitalism that sent me down to the Communist Party office began to get an overhaul the likes of which this country had never seen. A great man saved this country's capitalism from the capitalists and saved patriotic people like me from communism. Saved all of us from the dictatorial regime that results from communism. Let me tell you something that shook me. The death of Masaryk. Did that bother you, Mr. Ringgold, as much as it bothered me? I always admired Masaryk in Czechoslovakia, ever since I first heard his name and what he was doing for his people. I always thought of him as a Czech Roosevelt. I don't know how to account for his murder. Do you, Mr. Ringgold? I was troubled by it. I couldn't believe the communists could kill a man like that. But they did. Sir, I don't want to get started having a political argument. I'm going to ask you one single question, and I'd like you to answer so that my son and I know where we stand. Are you a member of the Communist Party? No, Doctor, I'm not. Now, I want my son to ask you. Nathan, I want you to ask Mr. Ringgold if he is now a member of the Communist Party. To put such a question to somebody went against my every political principle. But because my father wanted me, and because my father had asked Ira already to no ill effect, and because of Sam and Sidney, my father's dead younger brothers, I did it. Are you Ira? I asked him. Nope. No, sir. You don't go to meetings of the Communist Party? My father asked. I do not. You don't plan up where you want Nathan to visit you. What's the name of the place? Zinktown, New Jersey. You don't plan up there to take him to any such meetings? No, Doctor, I don't. I plan on taking him swimming and hiking and fishing. I'm glad to hear that, said my father. I believe you, sir. May I now ask you a question, Dr. Zuckerman? Ira asked, smiling at my father in that droll, sideways way he smiled when he was playing Abraham Lincoln. Why do you have me down for a Red in the first place? The Progressive Party, Mr. Ringgold. Do you have Henry Wallace down for a Red, the former vice president to Mr. Roosevelt? Do you think Mr. Roosevelt would choose a Red for vice president of the United States of America? It's not as simple as that, my father replied. I wish it were. But what's going on in the world is not simple at all. Dr. Zuckerman, said Ira, changing tactics. You wonder what I'm doing with Nathan? I envy him. That's what I'm doing with him. I envy that he has a father like you. I envy that he has a teacher like my brother. I envy that he has good eyes and can read without glasses a foot thick, and isn't an idiot who's going to quit school so as to go out and dig ditches. I've got nothing hidden and nothing to hide, Doctor, except that I wouldn't mind a son like him myself someday. Maybe the world today isn't simple, but this sure is. I get a kick out of talking to your boy. Not every kid in Newark takes as his hero Tom Paine. Here my father stood up and extended his hand to Ira. I am a father, Mr. Ringgold, to two boys, to Nathan and to Henry, his younger brother, who is also somebody to crow about. And my responsibilities as a father, well, that's all that this has been about. Ira took my father's ordinary-sized hand in his huge one and pumped it once very hard, so hard, with such sincerity and warmth, that oil, or at least water, a pure geyser of something, might as a result have come gushing from my father's mouth. Dr. Zuckerman, Ira said, you don't want your son stolen from you, and nobody here is going to steal him. Whereupon, I had to make a superhuman effort not to start to bawl. I had to pretend to myself that my whole aim in life was not to cry, never to cry at the sight of two men affectionately shaking hands, and I barely managed to succeed. They'd done it. Without shouting, without bloodshed, without the motivating, distorting rage. Magnificently, they had pulled it off, though largely because Ira was not telling us the truth. I'll insert this here and not return to the subject of the wound inflicted on my father's face. I count on the reader to remember it when that seems appropriate. Ira and I left my father's office together, and purportedly to celebrate my upcoming summer visit to Zingtown, but also, complicitously, to celebrate our victory over my dad, we went to Stosh's, a few blocks away, to have one of Stosh's overstuffed ham sandwiches. I ate so much with Ira at 4:15 that when I got home at 5 or 6, I had no appetite and sat at my place at the table while everybody else ate my mother's dinner. And it was then that I observed in my father's face the wound. I had planted it there earlier by going out the door of his office with Ira and not staying behind to talk a little to him until the next patient showed up. At first, I tried to think that maybe I was guiltily imagining that wound because of having felt not necessarily contemptuous of him, but certainly superior, leaving virtually arm in arm with Iron Rin of the free and the brave. My father didn't want his son stolen from him, and though, strictly speaking, nobody had stolen anybody, the man was no fool and knew that he had lost, and communist or no communist, the 6-foot 6-inch intruder had won. I saw in my father's face a look of resigned disappointment, his kind gray eyes softened by, distressfully subdued by, something midway between melancholy and futility. It was a look that would never be entirely forgotten by me when I was alone with Ira, or later with Leo Glucksman, Johnny O'Day, or whomever. Just by taking instruction from these men, I seemed to myself somehow to be selling my father short. His face, with that look on it, was always looming up, superimposed on the face of the man who was then educating me in life's possibilities. His face bearing the wound of betrayal. The moment when you first recognize that your father is vulnerable to others is bad enough, but when you understand that he's vulnerable to you, still needs you more than you any longer think you need him, when you realize that you might actually be able to frighten him, even to quash him if you wanted to, well, the idea is at such cross purposes with routine filial inclinations that it doesn't even begin to make sense. All the laboring he had gone through to get to be a chiropodist, a provider, a protector, and now I was running off with another man. It is, morally as well as emotionally, a more dangerous game than one knows at the time, getting all those extra fathers like a pretty girl gets beaux. But that was what I was doing. Always making myself eminently adoptable, I discovered the sense of betrayal that comes of trying to find a surrogate father, even though you love your own. It isn't that I ever denounced my father to Ira or anyone else for a cheap advantage. It was enough just, by exercising my freedom, to dump the man I loved for somebody else. If only I had hated him, it would have been easy. In my 3rd year at Chicago, I brought a girl home with me at Thanksgiving break. She was a gentle girl, mannerly and clever, and I remember the pleasure my parents took in talking to her. One evening, while my mother stayed in the living room entertaining my aunt, who had eaten dinner with us, my father came out to the corner drugstore with the girl and me. And sitting in a booth together, we all three ate ice cream sundaes. At one point, I went over to buy something like a tube of shaving cream at the pharmacy counter, and when I got back to the table, I saw my father leaning toward the girl. He was holding her hand, and I overheard him telling her, "We lost Nathan when he was 16. 16, and he left us." By which he meant that I had left him. Years later, he would use the same words with my wives, 16, and he left us. By which he meant that all my mistakes in life had flowed from that precipitate departure of mine. He was right, too. If it weren't for my mistakes, I'd still be at home sitting on the front stoop. It was about 2 weeks later that Ira went as far as he could toward telling the truth. He was in Newark one Saturday to see his brother, and he and I met downtown for lunch at a bar and grill near City Hall where, for 75 cents, 6 bits, to Ira. They served charcoal broiled steak sandwiches with grilled onions, pickles, home fries, coleslaw, and ketchup. For dessert, we each ordered apple pie with a rubbery slice of American cheese, a combination that Ira had introduced me to, and that I assumed to be the manly way you ate a piece of pie in a bar and grill. Then Ira opened a package he was carrying and presented me with a record album called The Soviet Army Chorus and Band in a Program of Favorites, conducted by Boris Alexandrov, featuring Arthur Eisen and Alexei Sergeyev, basses, and Nikolai Abramov, tenor. On the cover of the album was a picture, photograph courtesy Sovphoto, of the conductor, the band, and the chorus, some 200 men, all wearing Russian military dress uniforms and performing in the great marble Hall of the People, the Hall of the Russian Working People. Ever hear them? Never, I said. Take it home and listen. It's yours. Thanks, Ira. This is great. But it was awful. How could I take this album home? And at home, how could I listen? Instead of driving back to the neighborhood with Ira after lunch, I told him I had to go over to the public library, the main branch on Washington Street, to work in a history paper. Outside the bar and grill, I thanked him again for lunch in the present, and he got into a station wagon and drove back to Murray's on Lehigh Avenue, while I proceeded down Broad Street in the direction of Military Park and the big main library. I walked past Market Street and all the way to the park, as if my destination were indeed the library, but then, instead of turning left at Rector Street, I ducked off to the right and took a back way along the river to reach Pennsylvania Station. I asked a newsdealer in the station to change $1 for me. I took the 4 quarters over to the storage area, and I put one of them into the coin slot of the smallest of the lockers, and into the locker I shoved the record album. After slamming the door shut, I nonchalantly deposited the locker key in my trouser pocket and proceeded then to the library, where I had nothing to do except to sit for several hours in the reference room, worrying about where I was going to hide the key. My father was around the house all weekend, but on Monday he went back to his office, and on Monday afternoons my mother went up to Irvington to visit her sister, and so after my last class, I jumped on a number 14 bus across the street from school, took it to the end of the line to Penn Station, removed the record album from the locker, put it in the Bamberger shopping bag I had folded up inside my notebook that morning and taken with me to school. At home, I hid the record album in a small windowless bin in the basement where my mother stored our set of glass Passover dishes and grocery cartons. Come the spring and Passover, when she removed the dishes for us to use that week, I'd have to find another hiding place. But for the time being, the album's explosive potential was diffused. Not until I got to college was I able to play the records on a phonograph, and by then Ira and I were already drifting apart. Which didn't mean that when I heard the Soviet Army chorus singing, "Wait for your soldier," and "To an Army Man," and "A Soldier's Farewell," and, yes, Dubinushka, the vision of equality and justice for working people all over the world wasn't reawakened in me. In my dormitory room, I felt proud for having had the guts not to ditch that album, even if I still hadn't guts enough to understand that, with the album, Ira had been trying to tell me, yes, I'm a communist, of course I'm a communist, but not a bad communist, not a communist who would kill Masaryk or anyone else. I am a beautiful, heartfelt communist who loves the people and who loves these songs. What happened the next morning? I asked Murray. Why did Ira come to Newark that day? Well, Ira slept late that morning. He'd been up with Eve about the abortion till 4, and around 10 a.m. he was still asleep when he was awakened by someone shouting downstairs. He was in the master bedroom on the 2nd floor on West 11th Street, and the voice was coming from the foot of the staircase. It was Sylphid. Did I mention that the first thing to drive Ira wild was Sylphid telling Eve that she wasn't coming to their wedding? Eve told Ira that Sylphid was doing some kind of program with a flutist, and that the Sunday of the wedding was the only day the other girl could rehearse. He himself doesn't particularly care if Sylphid's coming to the wedding, but Eve does, and she's crying about it, and she's very distraught, and this upsets him. Constantly, she gives the daughter the instruments and the power to hurt her, and then she's hurt. But this is the first time he sees it, and he's infuriated. Her mother's wedding? Ira said. How can she not come to her mother's wedding if that's what her mother wants? Tell her she's coming. Don't ask her. Tell her. I can't tell her, Eve says. This is her professional life. This is her music. Okay, I'll tell her, Ira says. The upshot was that Eve talked to the girl, and God knows what she said or promised or how she begged, but Sylphid showed up at the wedding in those clothes of hers, a scarf in her hair. She had kinky hair, so she wears these Greek scarves rakishly, as she thought, and they drive her mother crazy. Wears peasant blouses that make her look enormous, sheer blouses with Greek embroidery on them, hoop earrings, lots of bracelets. When she walks, she clinks. You hear her coming. Embroidered schmattes and lots of jewelry. Wore the Greek sandals that you could buy in Greenwich Village, the thongs that tie up to the knees and that dig in and they leave marks, and this also makes Eve miserable. But at least the daughter was there, however she looked, and Eve was happy, and so Ira was happy. At the end of August, when both their shows were off the air, they married and went up to Cape Cod for a long weekend, and then they got back to Eve's place, and Sylphid has disappeared. No note, nothing. They call her friends. They call her father in France, thinking maybe she'd decide to go back to him. They call the police. On the fourth day, Sylphid finally checks in. She's on the Upper West Side with some old teachers she had at Juilliard. She'd been staying with her. Sylphid acts as though she didn't know when they were getting back, and that explains why she didn't bother to call from 96th Street. That evening, they all eat dinner together, and the silence is awful. It doesn't help the mother any to watch the daughter eat. Sylphid's weight makes Eve frantic on a good night, and this night is not good. When she finished each course, Sylphid always cleaned her plate the same way. Ira'd been around army mess halls, crummy diners. Lapses of etiquette didn't bother him all that much, but Eve was refinement itself, and watching Sylphid cleaning up was, as Sylphid well knew, a torment for her mother. Sylphid would take the side of her index finger, you see, and she would run it around the edge of the empty plate so as to get all the gravy and the leavings. She'd lick everything off the finger, then she'd do it again and again until her finger squeaked against the plate. Well, on the night that Sylphid decided to come home after her disappearance, she started cleaning her plate that way of hers at dinner, and Eve, who was screwed pretty tight on an ordinary evening, came undone. Could not keep that smile of the ideal mother plastered serenely across her face 1 second more. "Stop it," she screamed. "Stop it. You're 23 years old. Stop it, please." Suddenly, Sylphid is up on her feet and clubbing at her mother's head, going after her with her fist. Ira leaps up, and that's when Sylphid screams at Eve, "You kike bitch!" And Ira sinks back into his chair. "No," he says, "no, that won't do. I live here now. I'm your mother's husband, and you cannot strike her in my presence. You cannot strike her, period. I forbid it. And you cannot use that word, not in my hearing, never. Never in my hearing. Never use a filthy word again." Ira gets up, and he leaves the house, and he takes one of his calming down hikes from the village, walks all the way up to Harlem and back, tries everything so as not to outright explode, tells himself all the reasons why the daughter's upset. Our stepmother and our father, remembers how they treated him, remembers everything he hated about them, everything awful that he swore he would never be in life, but what's he to do? The kid takes a swing at her mother, calls her a kike bitch. What is Ira going to do? He gets home around midnight and he does nothing. He goes to bed, gets in bed with the brand new wife, and amazingly, that's it. In the morning, he sits down at breakfast with the brand new wife and with the brand new stepdaughter, and he explains that they are all going to live together in peace and harmony, and that to do this, they must have respect for one another. He tries to explain everything reasonably, the way nothing was ever explained to him when he was a kid. He's still appalled by what he saw and heard, furious about it, yet he's trying his damnedest to believe that Sylphid isn't really an anti-Semite in the true Anti-Defamation League sense of the word, which more than likely was the case. Sylphid's insistence upon ego justice for Sylphid was so extensive, so exclusive, so automatic, that a grand historical hostility of even the simplest, most undemanding sort, like hating Jews, could never have taken root in her. There was no room in her. Anti-Semitism was too theoretical for her anyway. The people Sylphid could not endure, she could not endure for a good, tangible reason. There was nothing impersonal about it. They stood in her way and blocked her view. They affronted the regal sense of dominance, her droit de fille. The whole incident, Ira rightly surmises, hasn't to do with hating Jews. About Jews and Negroes, about any group that presents a knotty social problem, as opposed to somebody posing an immediate private problem, she does not care one way or the other. She is concerned at the moment only with him. Consequently, she allows to break out into the open a malicious epithet that she instinctively gauges to be so repugnant, so foul and disgusting and out of bounds, as to cause him to walk out the door and never again set foot in her house. Kike bitch is her protest not against the existence of Jews or even against the existence of her Jewish mother, but against the existence of him. But having figured all this out overnight, Ira goes ahead, cagely he thinks, not to ask Silford for an apology due him, let alone to take the hint and disappear, but to offer her an apology. This is how the Shruti is going to tame her, by offering an apology for his being an interloper, for his being a stranger, an outsider, for his being not her own father, but an unknown quantity whom she doesn't have any reason in the world to like or to trust. He tells her that since he's another human being, and human beings don't have a great record going for them, there's probably every reason to dislike him and distrust him. He says, I know the last guy wasn't so hot. Why don't you try me out? My name isn't Jumbo Friedman. I'm a different person from a different outfit with a different serial number. Why not give me a chance, Silford? How about giving me 90 days? Then he explains to Silford Jumbo Friedman's rapacity, how it stems from America's corruption. It's a dirty game, American business. It's an insider's game, he tells her, and Jumbo was the classic insider. Jumbo isn't even a speculator in real estate, which would be bad enough. He's a stalking horse for the speculator. He gets a piece of the deal, and he doesn't even put down a dime. Now, basically, in America, big money is made through secrets. You understand? Transactions that are deep underground. Sure, everybody's supposed to play by the same rules. Sure, there is the pretense to virtue, the pretense that everybody is playing fair. Look, Silford, do you know the difference between a speculator and an investor? An investor holds the real estate and has the risk involved. He rides the gains or suffers the loss. A speculator trades land like sardines. Fortunes are made this way. Now, before the crash occurred, people had speculated with money they had got through taking out the value of the property, extracting from the banks the amortized value in terms of cash. What happened was that when all of these loans were called, they lost their land. The land went back to the banks. Enter the Jumbo Friedmans of the world. For the banks to raise some cash on this worthless paper they were holding, they had to sell it at an enormous discount, a penny on a dollar. Ira the educator, the Marxist economist, Ira, the star pupil of Johnny O'Day. Well, Eve is elated, a new woman, everything is wonderful again, a real man for herself, a real father for her daughter. At last a father who does what a father's supposed to do. Now, the illegal part of this, Silford, the way it is a fixed deal, Ira explains, the collusion involved. When the lecture is finally over, Eve gets up and goes over and takes Silford's hand, and she says, I love you. But not once. It's, I love you, I love you, I love you, I love you, I love you. She keeps holding tight to the kid's hand and saying, I love you. Each repetition is more heartfelt than the last. She's a performer. She can convince herself when something is heartfelt. I love you, I love you, I love you. And does Ira think to himself, go? Does Ira think to himself, this woman is under assault, this woman is up against something I know a little something about, this is a family at war, and nothing I do is going to work? No. He thinks that the Iron Man who has beaten back every disadvantage to get where he's got is not going to be defeated by a 23-year-old. The guy is tenderized by sentiment. He's madly in love with Eve Frame, and he's never known a woman like her. He wants to have a child by her. He wants to have a home and a family and a future. He wants to eat dinner the way people do, not alone at some counter somewhere pouring sugar into his coffee out of a grimy canister, but around a nice table with a family of his own. Just because a 23-year-old throws a temper tantrum, is he going to deny himself everything he has ever dreamed of? Fight the bastards. Educate the bastards. Change them. If anybody can make things work and straighten people out, it's Ira and his persistence. And things do calm down. No fisticuffs, no explosions. Silford appears to be getting the message. Sometimes at the dinner table, she even tries for 2 minutes to listen to what Ira is saying. And he thinks it was the shock of my arrival. That's all it was. because he's Ira, because he doesn't give in, because he doesn't quit, because he explains everything to everybody 62 times, he believes he's got it licked. Ira demands respect from Sylphid for her mother, and he believes he's going to get it. But that is just the demand that Sylphid cannot forgive. As long as she can boss her mother around, she can have everything she wants, which makes Ira an obstacle right off. Ira shouted, Ira yelled, but he was the first man in Eve's life who ever treated her decently, and that's what Sylphid couldn't take. Sylphid was beginning to play professionally, and she was subbing as second harpist in the orchestra at Radio City Music Hall. She was called pretty regularly, once or twice a week, and she'd also got a job playing at a fancy restaurant in the East 60s on Friday night. Ira would drive her from the village up to the restaurant with a harp, and then go and pick her and the harp up when she finished. He had the station wagon, and he'd pull up in front of the house and go inside and have to carry it down the stairs. The harp is in its felt cover, and Ira puts one hand on the column and one hand in the sound hole at the back, and he lifts it up, lays the harp on a mattress they keep in the station wagon, and drives Sylphid and the harp uptown to the restaurant. At the restaurant, he takes the harp out of the car, and big radio star that he is, he carries it inside. At 10:30, when the restaurant is finished serving dinner and Sylphid's ready to go back to the village, he goes around to pick her up, and the whole operation is repeated. Every Friday, he hated the physical imposition that it was. Those things weigh about 80 pounds, but he did it. I remember that in the hospital, when he had cracked up, he said to me, "She married me to carry her daughter's harp. That's why the woman married me, to hold that fucking harp." On those Friday night trips, Ira found he could talk to Sylphid in ways he couldn't when Eve was around. He'd ask her about being a movie star's child. He'd say to her, "When you were a little girl, when did it dawn on you that something was up, that this wasn't the way everyone grew up?" She told him that it was when the tour buses went up and down their street in Beverly Hills. She said she never saw her parents' movies until she was a teenager. Her parents were trying to keep her normal, and so they downplayed those movies around the house. Even the rich kid's life in Beverly Hills with the other movie stars' kids seemed normal enough until the tour buses stopped in front of her house, and she could hear the tour guide saying, "This is Carlton Pennington's house where he lives with his wife, Eve Frame." She told him about the production that birthday parties were for the movie stars' kids. Clowns, magicians, ponies, puppet shows, and every child attended by a nanny in a white nurse's uniform. At the dining table, behind every child, would be a nanny. The Penningtons had their own screening room, and they ran movies. Kids would come over, 15, 20 kids, and the nannies came for that too, and they all sat at the back. At the movies, Sylphid had to be dressed to the nines. She told him about her mother's clothes, how alarming her mother's clothes were to a little kid like her. She told him about all the girdles and the bras and the corsets and the waist cinches and the stockings and the impossible shoes, all that stuff they wore in those days. Sylphid thought, how could she possibly ever pull it off? Not in a million years. The hairdos, the slips, the heavy perfume. She remembered wondering how this was all going to happen to her. She even told him about her father, just a few things, but enough for Ira to realize how adoring of him she'd been as a child. He had a boat called the Sylphid, docked off the coast of Santa Monica. On Sundays, they sailed to Catalina, her father at the helm. The two of them rode horses together. In those days, there was a bridle path that went up Rodeo Drive and down to Sunset Boulevard. Her father used to play polo behind the Beverly Hills Hotel and then go riding alone with Sylphid along the bridle path. One Christmas, her father had presents for a drop from a Piper Cub by one of the stuntmen from the studio. Swooped low over the back lawn and dropped them. Her father, she told him, had his shirts made in London. His suits and his shoes were made in London. Back then, no one in Beverly Hills walked around without ties and suits, but he was the best dressed of them all. To Sylphid, there had been no father more handsome, more delightful, more charming in all of Hollywood. And then, when she was 12, her mother divorced him, and Sylphid found out about his escapades. She told Ira all this stuff on those Friday nights, and in Newark he told it to me, and I was supposed to come away thinking that I had been dead wrong, that Ira would make this kid his pal yet. It was still the beginning of all of them living together, and all the conversations were to try to make some contact with Sylphid, to make peace with her and so on. And it seemed to work. Something like intimacy began to develop. He even started going in at night when Sylphid was practicing. He'd ask her, "How the hell do you play that thing?" "I got to tell you, every time I see anybody playing a harp," and Sylphid would say, "You think of Harper Marx," and they'd both laugh because that was true. "Where does the sound come from?" he asked her. Why are the strings different colors? How can you remember which pedal is which? Don't your fingers hurt? He asked 100 questions to show he was interested, and she answered them and explained how the heart worked and showed him her calluses, and things were looking up. Things were definitely beginning to look good. But then, that morning, after Eve said that she could not have the baby, and she wept, and he thought, okay, well, that's it, and agreed to take it to the doctor in Camden. That morning, he hears Sylphid at the bottom of the stairs. She is giving it to her mother, really laying into her, and Ira jumps out of bed to open the bedroom door, and that's when he hears what Sylphid is saying. This time she's not calling Eve a kike bitch. It's worse than that. Bad enough to send my brother straight back to Newark, and that's how you came to meet him. It puts him on our couch for 2 nights. That morning, that moment, was when Ira realized that it wasn't true that Eve felt she was too old to have a child with him. The alarm sounds, and he realizes that it wasn't true that Eve was worried about the effect of a new baby on her career. He realizes that Eve had wanted the baby too, no less than he did. That it had been no easy thing to decide to abort the child of a man she loved, especially at the age of 41. This is a woman whose deepest sense is her sense of incapacity, and to experience the incapacity of not being generous enough to do this, not being big enough to do this, of not being free enough to do this, that was why she had been crying so hard. That morning, he realizes that the abortion wasn't Eve's decision. It was Sylphid's. That morning, he realizes that it wasn't his baby to decide what to do with, it was Sylphid's baby to decide what to do with. The abortion was Eve evading the wrath of her daughter. Yes, the alarm sounds, but still not loud enough for Ira to clear out. Yes, all kinds of elemental things percolated up from Sylphid that had nothing to do with playing the harp. What he hears Sylphid saying to her mother is, if you ever try that again, I'll strangle the little idiot in its crib. The townhouse on West 11th Street where Ira lived with Eve Frame and Sylphid, its urbanity, its beauty, its comfort, its low-key aura of luxurious intimacy, the quiet aesthetic harmony of its 1,000 details, the warm habitation as a rich work of art, altered my conception of life as much as the University of Chicago would when I enrolled there a year and a half later. I had only to walk through the door to feel 10 years older and freed from family conventions that, admittedly, I'd grown up adhering to mostly with pleasure and without much effort. Because of Ira's presence, because of the lumbering, easy-going way he strode around the place in baggy corduroy pants and old loafers and checkered flannel shirts too short in the sleeves, I didn't feel intimidated by an atmosphere unknown to me of wealth and privilege. Because of those folksy powers of appropriation that contributed so much to Ira's appeal, at home both on Newark's Black Spruce Street and in Eve's salon, I quickly got the idea of how cozily comfortable, how domesticized high living could be. High culture as well. It was like penetrating a foreign language and discovering that, despite the alienating exoticism of its sounds, the foreigners fluently speaking it are saying no more than what you've been hearing in English all your life. Those hundreds and hundreds of serious books lining the library shelves, poetry, novels, plays, volumes of history, books about archaeology, antiquity, music, costume, dance, art, mythology, the classical records filed 6 feet high in cabinets to either side of the record player, those paintings and drawings and engravings on the walls, the artifacts arranged along the fireplace mantel and crowding the tabletops, statuettes, enamel boxes, bits of precious stone, ornate little dishes, antique astronomical devices, unusual objects sculpted of glass and silver and gold, some recognizably representational, others odd and abstract, were not decoration, not ornamental bric-a-brac, but possessions bound up with pleasurable living and at the same time with morality, with mankind's aspiration to achieve significance through connoisseurship and thought. In such an environment, roaming from room to room looking for the evening paper, sitting and eating an apple in front of the fire could in themselves be part of a great enterprise. Or so it seemed to a kid whose own house, though clean, orderly, and comfortable enough, had never awakened in him, or in anybody else, ruminations on the ideal human condition. My house, with its library of the Information Please Almanac and 9 or 10 other books that had come into our possession as gifts for convalescing family members, seemed by comparison shabby and bleak, a colorless hovel. I could not have believed back then that there was anything on West 11th Street that anyone would ever want to flee. It looked to me like the luxury liner of havens, the last place where you would have to worry about your equilibrium disturbed. At its heart, upright and massively elegant on the library's oriental rug, utterly graceful in its substantiality, and visible the instant you turned from the entryway into the living room, was that symbol, reaching back to civilization's enlightened beginnings, of the spiritually rarefied realm of existence, the gorgeous instrument whose shape alone embodies an admonishment to every defect of coarseness and crudeness in man's mundane nature. That stately instrument of transcendence, Sylphid's gold leaf, Lion and Healy harp. That library was to the rear of the living room and up a step, Murray was remembering. There were sliding oak doors that closed the one room off from the other, but when Sylphid practiced, Eve liked to listen, and so the doors were left open, and the sound of that instrument carried through the house. Eve, who started Sylphid on the harp out in Beverly Hills when she was 7, couldn't get enough of it. But Ira could make no sense of classical music, never listened to anything as far as I know, except the popular stuff on the radio and the Soviet Army chorus. And so at night, when he preferred to be sitting around downstairs in the living room with Eve talking, reading the paper, a husband at home, and so forth, he kept retreating to his study. Sylphid would be plucking away, and Eve would be doing her needlepoint in front of the fire, and when she'd look up, he'd be gone, upstairs, writing letters to O'Day. But after what she'd been through in their third marriage, the fourth, when it got going, was still pretty wonderful. When she met Ira, she was coming out of a bad divorce and recovering from a nervous breakdown. The third husband, Jumbo Friedman, was a sex clown from the sound of it, expert at entertaining them in the bedroom. Had a high old time of it altogether till she came home early from a rehearsal one day and found him in his upstairs office with a couple of tootsies. But he was everything Pennington wasn't. She had an affair with him out in California, obviously very passionate, certainly for a woman 12 years with Carlton Pennington, and in the end, Friedman leaves his wife, and she leaves Pennington, and she, Friedman, and Sylphid decamp for the East. She buys that house on West 11th Street, and Friedman moves in, sets up his office in what became Ira's study, and starts trading property in New York as well as in L.A. and Chicago. For a while, he is buying and selling Times Square property, and so he meets the big theatrical producers, and they all start to socialize together, and soon enough, Eve Frame is on Broadway. Drawing room comedies, thrillers, all starring the one-time silent screen beauty. One after another is a hit. Eve is making money hand over fist, and Jumbo sees that it's well spent. Being Eve, she goes along with this guy's extravagance, acquiescing to his wild ways. Is even caught up in the wild ways. Sometimes, when Eve would start to cry out of nowhere, and Ira would ask her why, she would tell him, "The things he made me do, what I had to do." After she wrote that book, and her marriage to Ira was all over the papers, Ira got a letter from some woman in Cincinnati. Said that if he was interested in a little book of his own, he might want to come out to Ohio for a talk. She'd been a nightclub entertainer back in the 30s, a singer, a girlfriend of Jumbo's. She said Ira might like to see some photographs Jumbo had taken. Maybe she and Ira could collaborate on a memoir of their own. He'd supply the words, she, for a price, would fork over the pictures. At the time, Ira was so hell-bent on getting his revenge that he wrote the woman back, sent her a check for $100. She claimed to have 2 dozen, and so he sent her the $100 she was asking for just in order to see one. Did he get it? No, she was true to her word. She sent them one all right, by return mail. But because I wasn't going to allow my brother to further distort people's idea of what his life had meant, I took it from him and destroyed it. Stupid. Sentimental, priggish, stupid, and not very far-sighted of me either. Circulating the picture would have been benevolent compared to what happened. He wanted to disgrace Eve with the picture? Look, once upon a time, all Ira thought about was how to alleviate the effects of human cruelty. Everything was funneled through that. But after that book of hers came out, all he thought about was how to inflict it. They stripped him of his job, his domestic life, his name, his reputation, and when he realized he had lost all of that, lost the status, and no longer had to live up to it, he shed iron rin. He shed the free and the brave. He shed the Communist Party. He even stopped talking so much. All that endless, outraged rhetoric. Going on and on, what this huge man really wanted to do was lash out. The talk was the way to blunt those desires. What do you think the Abe Lincoln Act was about? Putting on the stovepipe hat, mouthing Lincoln's words. But everything that ever tamed him, all the civilizing accommodations he shed, and he was stripped right back to the Ira who dug ditches in Newark, back to the Ira who mined zinc up in the Jersey Hills. He reclaimed his earliest experience when his tutor was the shovel. He made contact with the Ira before all the moral correction took place, before he'd been to Miss Frame's finishing school and taken all those etiquette lessons. Before he went to finishing school with you, Nathan, acting out the drive to father and showing you what a good, nonviolent man he could be. Before he went to finishing school with me. Before he went to finishing school with O'Day, the finishing school of Marx and Engels. The finishing school of political action, because O'Day was the first Eve, really. And Eve, just another version of O'Day, dragging him up out of the Newark ditch and into the world of light. Ira knew his own nature. He knew that he was physically way out of scale and that this made him a dangerous man. He had the rage in him and the violence, and standing 6.5 feet tall, he had the means. He knew he needed his Ira tamers, knew he needed all his teachers, knew he needed a kid like you, knew that he hungered for a kid like you, who'd got all he'd never got and was the admiring son. But after I married, a communist appeared. He shed the finishing school education, and he reclaimed the Ira you never saw, who beat the shit out of guys in the army. The Ira who, as a boy starting out on his own, used the shovel he dug with to protect himself against those Italian guys. Wielded his work tool as a weapon. His whole life was a struggle not to pick up that shovel. But after her book, Ira set out to become his own uncorrected first self. And did he? Ira never shirked a man-sized job, however onerous. The ditch digger made his impact on her. He put her in touch with what she had done. Okay, I'll educate her, he told me, without the dirty picture. And he did it. He did it all right. Enlightenment through the shovel. Early in 1949, some 10 weeks after Henry Wallace was so badly defeated, and I now know after her abortion, Eve Frame threw a big party, preceded by a smaller dinner party, to try to cheer Ira up, and he called our house to invite me to come. I had seen him only once again in Newark after the Wallace rally at the mosque, and until I got the astonishing phone call, "Ira Ringo, buddy, how's my boy?" I'd begun to believe that I'd never see him again. After the second time that we met and gone off for our first walk ever in Weequahic Park, where I learned about Iran, I mailed to him in New York a carbon copy of my radio play, The Stooge of Torquemada. As the weeks went by and there was no response from him, I realized the mistake I'd made in giving to a professional radio actor a play of mine, even one that I considered my best. I was sure that now that he had seen how little talent I had, I'd killed any interest he might have had in me. Then, while I was doing my homework one night, the phone rang and my mother came running into my room. "Nathan, dear, it's Mr. Ian Rinn." He and Eve Frame were having people to dinner, and among them would be Arthur Sokolow, whom he'd given my script to read. Ira thought I might like to meet him. My mother made me go to Bergen Street the next afternoon to buy a pair of black dress shoes, and I took my one suit to the tailor shop on Chancellor Avenue to have Shapiro lengthen the sleeves and the trousers. And then early one Saturday evening, I popped a sensen in my mouth, and, my heart beating as though I were intent on crossing the state line to commit murder, I went out to Chancellor Avenue and boarded a bus to New York. My companion at the dinner table was Sylphid. All the traps laid for me, the 8 pieces of cutlery, the 4 differently shaped drinking glasses, the large appetizer called an artichoke, the serving dishes presented from behind my back and over my shoulder by a solemn black woman in a maid's uniform, the finger bowl, the enigma of the finger bowl, everything that made me feel like a very small boy instead of a large one, Sylphid all but nullified with a sardonic wisecrack, a cynical explanation, even just with a smirk or the roll of her eyes, helping me gradually to understand that there wasn't as much at stake as all the pomp suggested. I thought she was splendid, in her satire particularly. My mother, Sylphid said, likes to make everything a strain the way it was when she grew up in Buckingham Palace. She makes the most of every opportunity to turn everyday life into a joke. Sylphid kept it up throughout the meal, dropped into my ear remarks rife with the worldliness of someone who'd grown up in Beverly Hills, next door to Jimmy Durante, and then in Greenwich Village, America's Paris. Even when she teased me, I felt relieved, as if my mishap might not lie but one course away. Don't worry too much about doing the right thing, Nathan. You'll look a lot less comical doing the wrong thing. I also took heart from watching Ira. He ate the same way here as he did at the hot dog stand across from Weequahic Park. He talked the same way, too. He alone among the men at the table was without a tie and dress shirt and a jacket, and though he didn't lack for ordinary table manners, it was clear from watching him spear and swallow his food that the subtleties of Eve's kitchen were not over-scrupulously assessed by his palate. He did not seem to draw any line between conduct permissible at a hot dog stand and in a splendid Manhattan dining room. Neither conduct nor conversation. Even here, where the silver candelabra were lit with 10 tall candles and bowls of white flowers illuminated the sideboard, everything made him hot under the collar. On this night, only a couple of months after the crushing Wallace defeat, the Progressive Party had received little more than 1 million votes nationwide, about a sixth of what it had anticipated, even something seemingly as uncontroversial as Election Day. I'll tell you one thing, he announced to the table, and everyone else's voice faded while his, strong and natural, charged with protest and barbed with contempt for the stupidity of his fellow Americans, promptly commanded, "You just listen to me." I think this darling country of ours doesn't understand politics. Where else in the world, in a democratic nation, do people go to work on Election Day? Where else are the schools still open? If you're young and you're growing up and you say, "Hey, it's Election Day, don't we have a day off?" Your father and mother say, "No, it's Election Day, that's all." And what are you left to think? How important can Election Day be if I have to go to school? How can it be important if the stores and everything else is open? Where the hell are your values, you son of a bitch? By son of a bitch, he was alluding to nobody present at the table. He was addressing everyone in his life he had ever had to fight. Here, Eve Frame put her finger to her lips to get him to rein himself in. "Darling," she said in a voice so soft it was barely audible. "Well, what's more important?" he loudly replied. "To stay home on Columbus Day? You close the schools up because of a shitty holiday, but you don't close them up because of Election Day?" "But nobody's arguing the point," Eve said with a smile, "so why be angry?" "Look, I get angry," he said to her. "I always got angry. I hope to my dying day I stay angry. I get in trouble because I get angry. I get in trouble because I won't shut up. I get very angry with my darling country when Mr. Truman tells people, and they believe him, that communism is the big problem in this country. Not the racism, not the inequities. That's not the problem. The communists are the problem. The 40,000 or 60,000 or 100,000 communists. They're going to overthrow the government of a country of 150 million people. Don't insult my intelligence. I'll tell you what's going to overthrow the whole goddamn place. The way we treat the colored people. The way we treat the working people. It's not going to be the communists who overthrow this country. This country is going to overthrow itself by treating people like animals." Seated across from me was Arthur Sokolow, the radio writer, another of those assertive, self-educated Jewish boys whose old neighborhood allegiances and illiterate immigrant fathers strongly determined their brusque, emotional style as men. Young guys only recently back from a war in which they discovered Europe and politics, in which they first really discovered America through the soldiers they had to live alongside, in which they'd begun without formal assistance, but with a gigantic, naive faith in the transforming power of art, to read the 50 or 60 opening pages of the novels of Dostoevsky. Until the blacklist destroyed his career, Arthur Sokolow, though not as eminent a writer as Corwin, was certainly in the ranks of the other radio writers I most admired. Arch Oboler, who wrote Lights Out, Hyman Brown, who wrote Inner Sanctum, Paul Reimer, who wrote Vic and Sade, Carlton E. Morse, who wrote I Love a Mystery, and William N. Robeson, who done a lot of war radio from which I also drew for my own plays. Arthur Sokolow's prize-winning radio dramas, as well as 2 Broadway plays, were marked by their intense hatred of corrupt authority as represented by a grossly hypocritical father. I kept fearing throughout dinner that Sokolow, a short, wide tank of a man, a defiant pile driver who'd once been a Detroit high school fullback, was going to point at me and denounce me to everyone at the table as a plagiarist because of all I had stolen from Norman Corwin. Following dinner, The men were invited up to Ira's second-floor study for cigars, while the women went to Eve's room to freshen up before the after-dinner guests began to arrive. Ira's study overlooked the flood-lit statuary in the rear garden, and on the 3 walls of bookshelves he kept all his Lincoln books. The political library he carried home in 3 duffel bags from the war, and the library he since accumulated browsing in the second-hand bookshops on 4th Avenue. After passing around cigars and advising his guests to take whatever they liked from the whiskey cart, Ira got his copy of my radio play out of the top drawer of the massive mahogany desk, the one where I imagined he kept up his correspondence with O'Day, and began to read aloud the play's opening speech, and to read it not to denounce me for plagiarism. Rather, he began by telling his friends, including Arthur Sokolow, "You know what gives me hope for this country?" And he pointed at me all aglow and tremulously waiting to be seen through. "I got more faith in a kid like this than in all those so-called mature people in our darling country who went into the voting booth prepared to vote for Henry Wallace, and all of a sudden they saw a big picture of Dewey in front of their eyes, and I'm talking about people in my own family. So they pulled down Harry Truman's lever. Harry Truman, who was going to lead this country into World War III, and that's their enlightened choice. The Marshall Plan, that is their choice. All they can think is to bypass the United Nations and to hem in the Soviet Union and to destroy the Soviet Union while siphoning off into their Marshall Plan hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars that could go to raising the standard of living for the poor in this country. But tell me, who is going to hem in Mr. Truman when he drops his atomic bombs on the streets of Moscow and Leningrad? You think they won't drop atomic bombs on innocent Russian children? To preserve our wonderful democracy, they won't do that? Tell me another one. Listen to this kid here, still in high school, and he knows more about what's wrong with this country than every one of our darling countrymen in the voting booth." Nobody laughed or even smiled. Arthur Sokolow was backed against the bookcases, quietly paging through a book he'd taken down from Ira's Lincoln collection, and the rest of the men stood smoking their cigars and sipping their whiskey and acting as though my view of America were what they had gone out with their wives to hear that night. Only much later did I realize that the collective seriousness with which my introduction was received signified nothing more than how accustomed they were to the agitations of their overbearing host. "Listen," said Ira, "just listen to this. Play about a Catholic family in a small town and the local bigots." Whereupon Iron Rin launched into my lines, Iron Rin inside the skin, inside the voice box of an ordinary, good-natured Christian American of the kind I had in mind and knew absolutely nothing about. "I'm Bill Smith," Ira began, plunking down into his high-backed leather chair and throwing his legs up onto his desktop. "I'm Bob Jones. I'm Harry Campbell. My name doesn't matter. It's not a name that bothers anyone. I'm white and Protestant, and so you don't have to worry about me. I get along with you. I don't bother you. I don't annoy you. I don't even hate you. I quietly earn my living in a nice little town. Centerville. Middletown. OK Falls. Forget the name of the town. Could be anywhere. Let's call it anywhere." Many people here in Anywhere give lip service to the fight against discrimination. They talk about the need to wreck the fences that keep the minorities in social concentration camps. But too many carry on their fight in abstract terms. They think and speak of justice and decency and right, about Americanism, the brotherhood of man, and the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. All this is fine, but it shows that they are really unaware of the what and why of racial, religious, and national discrimination. Take this town, take Anywhere. Take what happened here last year when a Catholic family right around the corner from me found that zealous Protestantism can be just as cruel as Torquemada was. You remember Torquemada? The hatchet man for Ferdinand and Isabella, ran the Inquisition for the King and Queen of Spain. Guy who expelled the Jews from Spain for Ferdinand and Isabella back in 1492. Yeah, you heard right, pal. 1492. There was Columbus, sure. There was the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. And then there was Torquemada. There's always Torquemada. Maybe there always will be. Well, here's what happened right here in Anywhere, USA, under the Stars and Stripes, where all men are created equal, and not in 1492. Ira flipped through the pages, and it goes on like that, and here the ending. This is the end. The narrator again. A 15-year-old kid has the courage to write this. You understand? Tell me the network that would have the courage to put it on. Tell me the sponsor who in the year 1949 would stand up to Commandant Wood and his committee, who would stand up to Commandant Hoover and his stormtrooper brutes, who would stand up to the American Legion and the Catholic War veterans and the VFW and the DAR and all our darling patriots who wouldn't give a shit if they called him a goddamn red bastard and threatened to boycott his precious product. Tell me. Who would have the courage to do that because it's the right thing to do? Nobody. Because they don't give any more of a shit about freedom of speech than the guys I was with in the Army gave a shit about it. They didn't talk to me. Did I ever tell you that? I walked into the mess hall, you understand, 200 and some odd men. Nobody said hello. Nobody said anything because of the stuff I was saying and the letters I was writing to Stars and Stripes. Those guys gave you the distinct impression that World War II was being fought to spite them. Contrary to what some people may think about our darling boys, they didn't have the slightest notion, didn't know what the hell they were there for. Didn't give a shit about fascism, about Hitler. What did they care? Get them to understand the social problems of Negroes? Get them to understand the devious ways capitalism endeavors to weaken labor? Get them to understand why when we bomb Frankfurt, the IG Farben plants are not touched? Maybe I am myself handicapped by my lack of education, but the picayune minds of our boys make me violently sick. It all comes to this. He suddenly reads from my script. If you want a moral, here it is. The man who swallows the guff about racial, religious, and national groups is a sap. He hurts himself, his family, his union, his community, his state, and his country. He's the stooge of Torquemada. Written, Ira said, angrily tossing the script down on his desk, by a 15-year-old kid.